Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. You parents and grandparents know that when your kids are little, you let them get away with things that you don't as they get older. You expect a toddler to be selfish with toys and to cry when someone else is playing with their favorite toy in the church nursery. But there comes a point as they get older that they mature emotionally and they begin to grasp the concept of sharing and not crying about every little thing. You don't want them acting that way when they're at age 8, right? Okay, that's the process of maturing. Now, as believers, we need to mature in our faith as well, but not everyone matures, do they? There are probably some people in your church, maybe even in your class, who have been Christians for decades, but they're not any more mature than they were the day of their conversion. And this isn't a new issue, though, is it? Hebrews 5:12 says this: in fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's Word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. The writer was indicating that some of his audience, they were still babies in the faith, even though they had been believers for some time. And that's what we're going to be looking at this week, maturing faith. This is our final lesson in this unit that's called Owning a Faith That Matters. The focal passage is Luke 17, the first 10 verses, and the point is faith matures as we humbly obey God. Well, in the opening verses of this week's lesson, in Luke 17, 1 through 4, we read about people who offend, those who are offended, and the process of forgiveness. Well, Jesus began this section by saying that stuff is going to happen. People are going to stumble in their faith. We are imperfect people living in an imperfect world. But you had better not be the one that causes one of these little ones to stumble in their faith. Now, when Jesus spoke of little ones, he wasn't talking specifically about children. This is where looking at a parallel passage like Matthew 18:6 that comes in handy. That verse says, if anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Well, Jesus was talking about believers, especially new converts to the faith when he was talking about little ones. So don't be the one who causes a new believer to stumble in their faith. And as you're probably aware, that the ancient Romans, they had various forms of executing criminals, including crucifixion, of course, beheading, throwing the person to wild animals, burning at the stake, crushing them with heavy stones, heavy weights, and drowning with a millstone tied around their neck. So Jesus wasn't referencing some imaginary form of punishment. The original audience knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. But what Jesus didn't say was that when a person causes someone else to stumble in their faith, then as a punishment, they should be drowned. He didn't say that. No, he said it would be better for the millstone drowning to happen than to cause someone to stumble in their faith. Well, why is that? Well, let's play out that scenario. If what I say or do or teach causes you to question your faith and possibly give up on being a follower of Jesus, what are the long-term ramifications of that? There's really no telling how many future generations of your descendants my action will affect. If you walk away from church, your kids are less likely to attend church, and so on down the line. That's why it would be better for the person to suffer a horrible death on this earth and not interrupt someone else's faith journey, as opposed to potentially generations of others turning their back on the gospel. Well, what are some ways that we are stumbling blocks? Now, I submit that being a Sunday-only Christian is one way. You've probably heard something like this before. Yeah, I started going to your church, and I don't do that anymore. I work with Mr. So-and-so, one of your deacons, and he's always telling some of the worst off-color jokes. Stumbling block. What about the person who always has to make some stink about something in business meeting? Another stumbling block. And you can probably think of scores of other examples of how we can be stumbling blocks to other people. God does not take that lightly. That's why Jesus said, so watch yourselves, at the beginning of verse 3. So that's a warning to those who sin against someone by being a stumbling block. But what if you're the one who's wronged? What should a mature Christian do? Jesus said to rebuke them. That sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? Rebuke is when you strongly disapprove and correct someone. That's what Jesus expects of a person with a mature faith. But what would an immature Christian do? Well, they'd feel sorry for themselves. They'd talk about it with their friends and for support, hoping that they'd take your side on it. Post one of those Facebook or other social media posts and talk about somebody in some cloaked language and maybe end it with "just saying" at the end of it. All those kind of things. Maybe even offering up a prayer request that's not completely veiled. People can kind of read into it. Those kind of things. But you know what? We are called to be upfront and honest. And I'm going to admit this. That's easy to say. That's easy to talk about in Sunday school. But it's much more difficult to do that in real life. But you know what? Making the right choices, doing the right thing, making those godly choices, that is not always easy, is it? So, you correct them, and they repent. They apologize and say, "I'll never do it again." Okay, that's great. Perhaps it's not too difficult to forgive them for that. But you know what? Just a little while later, they do the same thing. Or perhaps they offend you in a different way. And they apologize and ask for forgiveness. Well, what do you do then? You give them another chance? Well, maybe, 3 strikes and you're out. What did Jesus say? He said, keep on forgiving, even if they sin against you, and ask for forgiveness 7 times in that day. Now, Jesus didn't say to keep count, and you only have to forgive 7 times in a 24-hour period, and here comes time 8. No, he didn't say that at all. He said, even if they sin against you 7 times. Jesus stated this a little differently in Matthew 18, verses 21 and 22, when he told Peter to forgive 70 times 7 or 77 times, depending on your translation. In both cases, the point is this: keep on forgiving. And what was the disciples' response to Jesus' statement? Well, let's see that as we read verses 5 and 6 in Luke 17. They said, "Increase our faith." That's how they responded. It's like the disciples were saying, "There's no way we can do this. Jesus, zap us with some more faith. Infuse us with some more faith so we can forgive someone that much." Do you wonder why Jesus wanted his disciples to repeatedly forgive someone who repeatedly sinned against them? Well, because it's like I said last week, the character of God should be reflected in his followers. God forgives us constantly, often for the same sin, over and over, and he expects us to do the same. Jesus addressed the disciples' request for a faith booster. He basically said, you don't need any more faith, but just a tiny amount of faith the size of a mustard seed. If you have that, then you can accomplish great things. And think about this. As a believer, what or whom is your faith in? It's in God. You see, it isn't the size of your faith, but the object of your faith that accomplishes things, even miraculous things. God can enable you to forgive and keep on forgiving, something that we just don't want to do on our own. So Jesus juxtaposed the smallness of a mustard seed to the huge, impossible task that it can accomplish by referring to the uprooting of a mulberry tree. A mulberry tree can be very tall and have stiff branches, and their roots can grow as much as 30 feet in any direction, making it very difficult to pull up. Jesus said that the smallest amount of faith can do miraculous things. You may find it difficult to keep on forgiving, but endless forgiving is God's nature. And like I said, believers should reflect his nature. He can enable you to keep on forgiving, even if you find it to be one of those uprooting a mulberry tree sized tasks. Well, let's say we do that. Someone sins against us and we have truly forgiven that person repeatedly throughout the day. We should get some kind of medal, right? Reward, plaque, extra jewel in our crown. Something, shouldn't we? Well, Luke 17, verses 7 through 10, that's our last set of scriptures for the week, that shows us that a mature faith does not expect recognition. In this illustration, that Jesus gave, there are two people. There's the master and there's the servant. And in that culture, it wasn't unusual for people, even with just a modest means, to hire servants. And so, and that's true in many parts of the world today. You know, I have some friends who were missionaries, and they have served in different areas of the world, and they had hired for themselves or as missionaries maids or cooks, nannies, because that was the custom of that area. It definitely was not because our International Mission Board was paying them some outrageous salary. It was just the custom. Now, in Jesus' story, the servant's job included plowing, tending sheep, and cooking. When the servant was done with some of his tasks, would he expect to come in, sit at the master's table, and be served along with the master for doing his, just as a reward for doing his job? Well, of course not. The servant was just doing what was expected of him. In fact, there was more work for the servant to do. The point Jesus was making here is that obedience does not deserve a trophy. Well, let's say I come home one day and I say to my wife, "Guess what, Ruth? I was faithful to you today. Not once did I cheat on you. Aren't you proud of me? I hope you've prepared a special meal for me and for my faithfulness to you." Well, that would be ludicrous, wouldn't it? Ruth expects faithfulness from me. My meeting expectations does not deserve any special recognition. When you are mature in your faith, you do what God expects from you, and that's obedience. And you don't expect any kind of special recognition or treatment. And guess what? That means obeying the easy and the tough things. God expects me not to commit murder? Check. I've got that one down. That's no problem. But forgiving someone multiple times in the same day for the same offense? That's expected as well. That's a command. So let's keep pressing on, doing what God has called and equipped us to do. Our reward, our thanks, our eating with the Master isn't in this life, but the next one, after we've completed our work. So the summary here: be careful not to be a stumbling block. Forgive as Christ forgave you. Don't expect a trophy for doing what you're supposed to do. Well, next week we're going to start a new series of lessons that's going to lead us right up to Easter. The unit's called It's All About Jesus. And guess what? All of the lessons will continue in the book of Luke. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate you. Don't forget, pray for and with your class this week.